If you go to your sources booklet, you'll realise that the Res Gestae is there in its absolute entirety, and that would suggest, therefore, that you do need to know and have read the whole of the Res Gestae. But the textbook, and you will find the pages for the Res Gestae in the textbook on page 189 to 193. The textbook, in fact, breaks this up into a number of different sections that they think might be important for you to understand about the Res Gestae. So I'm going to break my PowerPoints up into those sections so that you are aware of what he is trying to do through the Res Gestae with regards to these particular things. And so this first PowerPoint is going to be about the Res Gestae and what Augustus actually tells us himself about that triumviral period between 44 to 31 BC, between the death of Julius Caesar and the Battle of Actium. In fact, it's actually been quite a while since you looked at this particular period, so I just want to remind you of roughly what's going on, the chronology of that period between 44 to 31 BC, which I'm rather hoping will jog some memories for you. So if you remember rightly, Julius Caesar is killed by Brutus and Cassius, the assassins, in 44 BC, and in 43 BC, Mark Antony actually seizes the province of Cisalpine Gaul, and he takes it off the consul Decimus Brutus. And the consuls Hirtus and Pansa oppose Mark Antony, and the consuls of the Senate then call upon Octavian, who's 18 and has no political power at that time, to champion the Senate against Mark Antony. And that's the first sort of battle in 43 BC between Octavian and Mark Antony. In 42 BC, then, you get the Battle of Philippi, which is Octavian and Mark Antony versus Brutus and Cassius, who are the assassins of Julius Caesar. And I'm sure you remember that the Temple of Mars Altor is built because he vows to build that temple, providing he win the battle against Brutus and Cassius. Then in 36 BC, we go back to the fact that he has been fighting not just Brutus and Cassius, but in fact, if you remember rightly, both Lepidus and Sextus Pompey decide to sort of either ally themselves to him in the case of Lepidus, or in the case of Sextus Pompey legitimately held the province of Sicily on behalf of the Senate. He was a proconsul there. But in order to try and gain more power at Rome, he'd actually started to use his navy in Sicily to stop the grain supplies coming in. And that was causing rioting at Rome. It was causing all sorts of problems. So Octavian then sends Agrippa to take on Sextus Pompey in 36 BC. And then I've no doubt you remember your Horace and your Propertius poems when it comes to 31 BC, which is the Battle of Actium, when finally Octavian and Agrippa take on Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. And I just want to see what the Res Gestae tells us about each one of these incidents, really. The death of Julius Caesar, the Battle of Mutina, where he and the consuls fight Mark Antony, then 42 with the Battle of Philippi, where him and Mark Antony are now friends, and he's fighting Brutus and Cassius. 36 BC, where he's fighting Sextus Pompey down in Sicily at the Battle of Naulochus. And there's 31, where you've got the Battle of Actium, Agrippa and Octavian versus Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Let's just remind ourselves of what happened historically with some of these events then. Julius Caesar, 44 BC, he took too much power. He's made dictator for life by the Senate. That angers a number of senators, notably Brutus and Cassius, and a guy called Decimus Brutus, who is different to the other one. Julius Caesar is stabbed to death by Brutus and Cassius. They're then allowed to take up their provinces and allocate to them by the Senate. So they legitimately take up their provinces, Brutus and Cassius do. If you go to your sources booklet, right at the start, you'll find the whole of the Res Gestae in there, but don't worry, I've split this up into little bits for you. So Res Gestae, Julius Caesar, he simply says this about the entire affair: I drove into exile those men who'd murdered my father, avenging their deed by legal means, and afterwards, when I waged war against the state, I conquered them twice in battle. That's from Res Gestae 2. So here you need to go back to the last two slides, that's slide 3 and slide 4, and you need to answer these two questions. The answers will be on those slides, but you do need to think about them. So A, why does Augustus refer to Brutus and Cassius as the men who murdered my father, not the liberators of Rome? Think about what that phrase brings. B, copy and paste the words from the passage, that means the Res Gestae, that show that he is in the right in the Res Gestae and they are in the wrong when it comes to the death of Julius Caesar. Explain why he uses those particular words. It's 43 BC, and in that year Octavian defeated Mark Antony at something called the Battle of Mutina, and he gained the consulship. So what happened historically speaking? The year after Julius Caesar's death, Decimus Brutus was provincial governor of Cisalpine Gaul, that is the province closest to Rome. He'd been legitimately allocated that province by the Senate, but Mark Antony seized it from him. The Senate then sent the consuls Hirtius and Pansa to aid Decimus Brutus, but they didn't do very well. And then the Senate asked the 19-year-old Octavian to help the consuls. He had been adopted heir in Julius Caesar's will and was therefore very popular with Julius Caesar's army, but there was a problem. Under the Republic, only people who'd been consuls or praetors were actually put in charge of armies. The Senate were desperate for military help and voted Octavian proconsular powers, even though he'd never actually been a proconsul. Hirtius and Pansa, that is the consuls, were killed in battle. The historian Suetonius actually suggests that Octavian might have poisoned Pansa, but then Suetonius was always a bit of a gossip. And at the end, Mark Antony was defeated. Octavian thought that he should gain the honour of a triumph into Rome, that is, Octavian thought that the Senate should allow Octavian to have a triumph into Rome, but the Senate just didn't see it that way. He was too young. Decimus Brutus was allowed a triumph, but they thought Octavian was way too young. Octavian then had been useful to them, but they didn't reward him. Octavian was angry and marched on Rome with his army. The Senate was forced to make him a consul. So let's now look at what the Res Gestae says about the Battle of Mutina. Now we know what historically actually happened. So Augustus says this: at the age of 19, on my own initiative and at my own expense, I raised an army by way of which I liberated the Republic, which was being tyrannized by a faction. For this, the Senate, through honorific decrees, admitted me into its order during the consulship of Gaius Pansa and Aulus Hirtius, give me a consular position in declaring opinions, and they also gave me imperium, that means power. It ordered me as pro-praetor together with the consuls to provide that no harm should come to the state. The people appointed me as consul in the same year when both consuls had fallen in war, and triumvir for the administration of the empire. So looking at these exercises, you need to go back and look at what the historical background to the Battle of Mutina, which you'll find on slide 6, and then again to what the Res Gestae says about it, which you'll find on slide 7. According to Res Gestae 1, who is the person referred to as a tyranny of a faction who's attacking the state? Why do you think he's not mentioned by name by Octavian in this source? B, Octavian refers to himself as 19. In the Res Gestae, he says he's got the initiative to raise an army at its own expense. He claims he's the liberator of the Republic. He says the senator asked him to join them. He says the Senate asked him to help the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, and the Senate asked Octavian to protect the state. But see, what really happens? Do you think he portrayed himself? Why do you think he's portrayed himself as that way in the Res Gestae? So let's have a look at the Battle of Philippi. Let's remind ourselves what happened historically. After Antony was defeated at Mutina by Octavian in 43 BC, Octavian then found himself sidelined by the Senate, who refused to give him a triumph. Octavian then formed an alliance with Mark Antony and Lepidus, and in 42 BC Mark Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius. The later historian Suetonius tells us there were two battles. The first one, Octavian was driven from his camp and had to flee to Antony for help, and in the second one Antony's soldiers did most of the fighting. Afterwards, we're told Augustus showed no mercy, and after Brutus's death sent his head to Rome as a warning to others. This is what the Res Gestae says about the Battle of Philippi. I drove into exile those men who'd murdered my father, avenging their deed by legal means, and afterwards, when they waged war against the state, I conquered them twice in battle. Exercise 3 then. Brutus and Cassius were senators who were sent by the Senate to administer their province in Asia Minor. Why does Octavian simply refer to them as the murderers of my father, if they are legitimately there? B. Who isn't mentioned in these sections, and why not? C. What doesn't Octavian tell us about this battle, and why? D. Why does he stress the fact that he defeated Brutus and Cassius, quote, by legal means? Battle of Naulochus in 36 BC. Let's find out what happened historically. Sextus Pompey was the son of Pompey the Great and a legitimate provincial ruler of Sicily. He felt cut out of the triumvirate between Mark Antony, Octavian and Lepidus, and as a result he decided to disrupt the grain supply between Rome and Egypt. That caused riots in Rome, and it was difficult for Octavian to keep the peace. Agrippa was then dispatched to help Mark Antony and Lepidus's fleet. Res Gestae in the Battle of Naulochus. I freed the sea from pirates, and in that war about 30,000 captured slaves who had escaped and had taken up arms against the Republic are returned to their masters for punishment. Res Gestae 25. Exercise 4 then. A. How is Sextus Pompey referred to in the Res Gestae? B. How fair is it that he's referred to in that way? Try to cite some evidence from the background history. And C. In your opinion, why does Octavian portray the battle in this way? What happened historically at the Battle of Actium then? In 31 BC, Mark Antony gave Cleopatra the Alexandrian donations, which enabled Octavian to convince the Senate that war should be declared on Egypt. In fact, it was a war between both the Egyptian forces and the Roman forces that Antony also commanded. You've studied some rather florid poetry about Actium by Horace and by Propertius. These are Octavian's own words, and what he says about Actium, you'll notice they're much shorter and much more succinct than Horace or Propertius's version. Possibly, of course, partially because that poor old stonemason did not want to have to write too much, but there are other reasons for the portrayal here. So in Res Gestae 25 he says this: the whole of Italy and of its own volition swore allegiance to me and demanded that I lead them in the war that I won at Actium. That's Res Gestae 25. And in Res Gestae 27 it says, I added Egypt to the empire of the Roman people. Exercise 5 then. Go back over that information about Actium and think this through. Why doesn't he mention Mark Antony and Cleopatra directly? The Res Gestae is written to the Roman people. What benefits do you think adding Egypt to their empire brought them? And in Res Gestae 27, he mentions the war at Actium. But in fact, what in Res Gestae 27 on slide 16 does he mention is far more important than the war he won at Actium? So let's have a very quick overview of the Res Gestae and the Triumviral period. Mark Antony is not referred to directly in the Res Gestae, but as the tyranny of affection, which refers not just to Antony, but Antony's supporters too. Octavian suggests that he was asked to fight Antony at Mutina alongside the two consuls Hirtius and Pansa to make him seem much more like a champion of the Republic. Later, of course, he refers to the war I won at Actium. The refusal to name Antony is very consistent with Augustus's earlier propaganda. If you remember rightly, he doesn't mention Mark Antony at all. Horace doesn't mention Mark Antony at all in the poem Cleopatra. That poem is all about Octavian chasing Cleopatra. The idea of not mentioning Antony was to get people to forget that, in fact, Augustus had come to power as a result of the civil war against that particular faction. When it comes to Brutus and Cassius, they are also not mentioned by name, and in fact you'll note that none of his enemies that are alluded to in the Res Gestae are mentioned by name. Brutus and Cassius become the murderers of my father, to make people forget that they were senators, and again to make them forget that was civil war. It personalises the fight for Octavian. It also makes people forget that Caesar controversially became dictator. And Sextus Pompey, also not mentioned by name. He is mentioned in reference to the year of his consulship. So in the year that Sextus Pompey was consul, Octavian does mention him. But his references to the military campaigns against Sextus Pompey and his followers are as pirates. So neither Mark Antony, Brutus and Cassius, or Sextus Pompey are named directly. And most of that, of course, is because Mark Antony, Brutus, Cassius and Sextus Pompey were all legally and legitimately Romans that were in charge of their provinces because the Senate wanted them to be there, and Octavian has fought against them. So he doesn't want to be seen as anything less than the champion of the Senate. He is championing tyrannies of factions. He fights against Brutus and Cassius because they murdered his father. And Sextus Pompey was simply the destruction of a pirate. All of these things are taking people's eyes off the idea that he is fighting civil wars and onto either personal fights or fights where he champions enemies of the Roman Senate.